Todo esto es bioeconomía.
Bioeconomy.
En la Amazonía. Y promoverla nos lleva a un futuro con más
qualidade de vida,
Well-being.
calidad de vida,
oportunidades
económicas
Economic opportunities.
y protección de la biodiversidad.
Biodiversity.
conexão,
Innovation.
Convergencia para la bioeconomía en la Panamazonía. Panamazonía en red. Foro de innovación e inversiones en la bioeconomía. Sean bienvenidos.
Welcome everyone.
sejam bem-vindos.
Welcome, everybody, to the Pan-Amazonia on Red Bioeconomy Innovation and Investment Forum, promoted and supported by the Pan-Amazon Network for Bioeconomy. This forum is intended to foster connection, innovation, and convergence between stakeholders from different sectors in order to promote a locally led sustainable bioeconomy across the Amazonia. So today's panel is going to focus on the role of the bioeconomy as an important biodiversity climate nexus on regional and global agendas and its capacity for socio-environmental impact. My name is Julie McCarthy. I am the CEO of an organization called Nature Finance, and I will be your moderator today. For those who haven't come across Nature Finance, we're a global nonprofit organization that works with governments, multilateral development banks, financial institutions, civil society organizations to try and align finance with an economy that works for nature, climate, and people. We've been very involved with helping to support both Brazil and now South Africa's efforts to advance principles and commitments around integrating a sustainable bioeconomy into broader strategies around green economic transition and sustainable finance, and are really delighted to be here moderating this panel today. Let me now introduce our panelists. It is a privilege to welcome Minister Alejandro Bañol Salazar, who's the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development for the government of Colombia, and a dedicated environmental engineer and policy expert who has been really at the forefront of Colombia's efforts to integrate sustainability into national development. I'm also really delighted to welcome Brenda Izidio, who is another dynamic leader at the intersection of biodiversity, climate action, and sustainable development. Brenda currently works as a consultant on biodiversity and bioeconomy at IDB Invest. She is co-founder of the Brazilian Youth Biodiversity Network, and most recently, she helped launch the Brazilian Biodiversity and Climate Network, which is working to bridge the biodiversity and climate agendas with a strong focus on Brazil's specific biomes. So Minister Salazar, Brenda, it is a pleasure to have you here today, and we're really looking forward to hearing your insights on this topic. Let me just give a quick introduction, and then we're going to dive into questions and discussion with our panelists. We invite everyone in the audience to share questions in the chat, which we will try and pull from along the way. And this is a very multicultural panel, so you'll be hearing the discussion in English, Portuguese, and Spanish today, and I understand there'll be simultaneous translation throughout. So we're here today to discuss the role of the Amazon bioeconomy as a really important nexus of biodiversity and climate action in both a domestic, a regional, and an international context. In recent years, we've seen growing recognition of the need to better link biodiversity and climate in both policy and action, including through integrating them in global agendas, for example, through incorporating biodiversity into NDCs and adaptation plans, or through mobilizing climate finance for nature-based solutions, biodiversity positive actions in different frameworks. For example, Brazil recently making the decision to include the bioeconomy as a pillar in its country platform. Overall, I think it's increasingly clear that the bioeconomy offers enormous potential to address the connected challenges of climate change, food security, economic development, and sustainable growth. Just to step back for a moment, the bioeconomy broadly defined is the use of bio-based inputs to produce goods and services. And I think it's worth noting with this particular audience that Latin America has really been at the forefront of the bioeconomy's development, and specifically the development of socio-bioeconomy models that have brought forward some of the most innovative and ethically grounded ideas in the global bioeconomy conversation, really focused on equity, ancestral knowledge, and territory. The term bioeconomy has been rapidly evolving over the past decade and even recent years, and now means many different things in different contexts. So globally, it now covers an extraordinary landscape, everything from alternative fertilizers and feed made from bio-waste to bioplastics and new bioconstruction materials to biofuels, the blue economy, regenerative agriculture, nature as infrastructure, nature credit instruments. It's really quite an expansive conceptual umbrella, and it's rapidly growing right now. It has an estimated value of 4 to 5 trillion US dollars per annum, with growth potential up to 30 trillion over the next decade if properly enabled. So let me just conclude the kind of scene setting by noting that while the bioeconomy's potential to mitigate and adapt climate change has been widely noted and studied increasingly, there's much less discussion around how climate change impacts various sectors of the bioeconomy in a rapidly warming world. In a context where the UN tells us right now we're projected to overshoot 1.5 degrees Celsius, potentially by a significant degree. You know, there's going to be all kinds of new disruption in the form of floods and droughts and heat waves that they're already a fact of life for many countries in different contexts, and with their impact potentially being felt across different bioeconomy sectors in the Amazon and beyond. So it's important to recognize not only that the bioeconomy can be a powerful driver of climate action, but also that the bioeconomy itself is increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. And that makes it all the more urgent and imperative for stakeholders to try and capture and accelerate its benefits for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. So with that, let me turn to our panelists, and I'm going to ask my first question of Minister Salazar. So Minister, we know that aligning investments with national climate strategies can help boost coherence and investor confidence. Could you explain to us from the public sector perspective, what are the challenges Colombia faces when trying to foster a sustainable bioeconomy and mobilize finance within the framework of global and regional climate and biodiversity agendas?
Claro que sí. Buenas tardes para todos. Gracias a Julie, al BID en este evento y pues mi compañera.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Brenda and Julie McCarthy, and also our colleagues for this moment of reflection. It is important to say what you said, because when we think about Colombia, we have several aspects. The first one is that Colombian bioeconomy, within this biodiversity plan that was registered, 3% of the GDP of Colombia will happen through bioeconomy. And this implies in several articulation processes, several areas of the Ministry of Agriculture and Science, and several other ministries for us to be able to use this new production model of bioeconomy. And as we saw before as well, there's a social bioeconomy of the territory that goes together with the communities. So it's not only a biocommunity for anything. No, it's bioeconomy when we understand that we're talking about bioeconomy of the products and the added values of technology and so on. We can inject several $1 million to be able to say that we have a bioproduct. So if we think about these processes, and we want to change this narrative so that it's going to be a democratic and participative bioeconomy, and it will also involve the Amazon that is so rich. So what we have today are opportunities, the management of this wealth using these productive models. We're talking about 3 great models: a productive and sustainable bioeconomy, as in the case of Colombia, we have green things that are sustainable, more than 5,400 activities, productive activities and products, with a sustainability model that is verified by the Environmental Ministry. The second one is an economy with these products that come from an economy that is recognized in the territory. There could be a lack of investment capacity and technology, and this is not an excuse for us to stop generating this for the people. We have an economy that is in different channels. We're trying to bring this together to other companies, joining the production and processing chains. And the third point is socio-bioeconomy that can be boosted through these territorial models that are associative, used by the indigenous communities. We have great representatives, indigenous representatives in Colombia, and in COP16, we have an added value of this ancestral knowledge, and all of this is based on nature, on practices that are used in these communities, thinking about the wealth of nature. There's two great examples. The first one is the order around water. The Ministry of the Environment in Colombia is the one who adopted the first thing about this. So she has looked at the dynamics of restoration in the country, and we have to increase these areas that are reserved, and they go together with the mobilization of resources and the communities that are around these agroforest products. Then we can boost all of this forest economy and bioeconomy. We also have the order around the water, and the main thing is organized in the communities around the policies that are being generated in the communities. So we have a participation, and I think the order around this restoration, and then the strengthening of the bioeconomy. And we also have the part where we can, with this discourse of the panel, we can actually think about biodiversity and climate change. We've talked a lot about this as a region and a country. So I would like to say that Colombia has moved forward in terms of bioeconomy in different areas, thinking about its implementation. And we cannot understand this only through the large cities and capitals. It is necessary to understand that bioeconomy is done in the territory itself. So we have to think about the value chains and these bioingredients, and also the integration of these multiple looks and inversions and scalability and the territory. And we have this outcome so that all of this boosts the bioeconomies that we were able to implement in the country. So this is what I had to say. My time is up, and I will give the floor to Julie.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. And I apologize that I accidentally mistook you for the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development when in fact you are an advisor. So apologies for that. Brenda, I'd like to turn to you now for some reflections. You're currently leading efforts to connect the dots between biodiversity and climate through the Brazilian Biodiversity and Climate Network, as well as your work at IDB Invest. Could you share a little bit about how aligning these two agendas, in your view, can help strengthen the bioeconomy, both in Brazil and potentially across the region more broadly?
Bom, primeiramente,
Well,
boa tarde.
first of all, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone who is with us now. Thank you very much to the Pan-Amazonic Network of Bioeconomy for the invitation. And I would like to say that it's a pleasure to be at this event today that has brought other panels that are extremely important to discuss bioeconomy here in our region. And thank you also to Julie and Alejandro for sharing this space with me. It's definitely going to be very productive this afternoon. I would like to bring you to the context and some points that are strong, in my opinion, and they guide my life ever since I was 17 in these movements, environmental movements in Brazil. I think that we've had a division of nature in several boxes. We've been doing this for a long time. We divide the way that life is dynamic, and we have mirrored this in different agendas, different negotiations, different sectors, political sectors, policies. And in a way, this is good for us to get organized and think about it. Think about the local solutions for the challenges that have become more global over time, but they're also affecting each territory inside the Latin American countries, the Caribbean, as well as the whole planet. I believe that we do not divide climate and culture and ecosystems. All of this is interconnected. And this also has to do with the human rights agenda. So to make a connection that is very current, I think, even COP28 about climate and COP15, yeah, it was 15, COP15 about biodiversity, we were not really talking about this connection between climate and nature. Nature means biodiversity in this case, and the ecosystem services, and understanding that biodiversity is the manifestation of the traditions and the cultures, all of these services, the ecosystem that will be describing a little bit of the tradition of traditional communities, indigenous communities in the different regions. So Latin America and the Caribbean, they are a group of countries that have the greatest biodiversity in the world. And today we have the different nationalities representing Brazil and Colombia, in this case, two great countries. Brazil with the greatest biodiversity in the world. And fortunately, we have heard increasingly about this union, this junction, not only in the UN, but also the conferences in Rio with the UNFCCI and CBD, but also getting to the private sector. So today, I usually say that during this trajectory, it is still very short, but it has supplied me with some experience, and I was able to see a little bit of how this works, how the third sector works, which is the sector of the non-governmental organizations in Brazil, and also in the public sector with the municipal management, where I've already worked locally, as well as in the private sector as a consultant in the BID investment. So I think there is a current effort and a constant one of the private sector at the Brazil level, as well as at the Latin American level, of observing and bringing relevance to biodiversity. So not only focusing on the climate, because many times it is difficult to see these two agendas being disconnected, but this is what we know. Sometimes there's going to be some sort of solution that will benefit a mitigation or a reduction of CO2, of greenhouse gases, but it's not going to benefit, for example, the maintenance of biodiversity or the opposite. Sometimes we're going to have a solution which is more at the level of nature and increasing biological diversity in a certain place, but it is not going to act directly in the adaptation to some mitigation. So I have seen that the agenda of biodiversity has gained space, and this does not compete with the climate agenda, But more than ever, it is necessary to generate spaces like this for discussion and bringing into practice how we can strengthen this connection between the two agendas. And I would also say at a more negotiation level, negotiating the combat. If we look at the conferences in Rio and what happened, and we have bioeconomy, which is the solution that brings all of these topics together. And it comes in as a thread to sew together all of these stitches and highlighting that we are able to bring strength to bioeconomy through the generation of revenues for the indigenous population and green employment and other things that will help to remain for the standing forest to remain. That's what I had in my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And I just want to echo in my own experience the point that you made around nature to date sort of feeling either siloed or secondary to larger conversations around the climate crisis in a lot of international fora, whether it's amongst donors or it's amongst investors or even certain policymakers at times and in negotiations. Green is sort of understood in green economic transition to mainly be about climate, whereas nature has a huge role to play in that agenda. But I find likewise that when you come down to the country level in many instances, for example, in a place like Brazil, climate sort of writ large is meant to also incorporate nature. There's no sort of alienation between the two, often in terms of how people are thinking about the crisis and the challenges and the strategies that people need to undertake. And it does seem like that kind of more holistic, integrated perspective is becoming more mainstream, including amongst, for example, multilateral development banks and project finance and some of the other areas where things have felt very separate to date. Let me now, before we continue our conversation with another round of questions, invite everyone to watch a quick video by one of our bioeconomy correspondents, Mauricio Alcantara, from the Regenera Institute, which is on an initiative called Na Mesa da COP30, which highlights the importance of the local food culture and participation of local food system stakeholders in Amazonia, also during COP30.
Olá, todo mundo na rede. Meu nome é Maurício Alcântara, eu sou do Instituto Regenera e eu falo em nome da iniciativa Na Mesa da COP30. Vocês sabem qual que é a relação entre o que a gente come e a mudança do clima? A produção, o transporte, a distribuição e o consumo de comida correspondem a 30% das emissões de gases de efeito estufa no mundo. E no Brasil, que é o quinto maior país emissor, esse número chega a 74%. Isso é sobretudo por causa da produção de commodities e da maneira como destinamos a terra para a agropecuária. A boa notícia é que existem outros jeitos de produzir comida, com práticas agroecológicas que permitem produzir comida boa, em quantidade e em variedade, ao mesmo tempo em que sequestra carbono ao invés de emitir carbono, e ainda valorizando os saberes e as práticas de povos e comunidades tradicionais que desde sempre produzem comida enquanto mantêm a floresta de pé. Já existe muita produção agroecológica, e o Brasil é referencial desse campo. Mas então o que falta para que esse modelo seja regra e não exceção para o nosso abastecimento? Visibilidade, reconhecimento, valorização, incentivo. Nos próximos meses, Belém vai receber a Conferência do Clima da ONU. E essa é uma oportunidade ideal para mostrar para o Brasil e para o mundo que é possível abastecer um evento desse porte. E depois do evento, toda uma metrópole como a de Belém, com comida saudável para a saúde, para o planeta e para a sociedade, graças ao trabalho de produtores e agricultores familiares amazônicos que há muito tempo produzem o tipo de comida que o planeta precisa. Para isso, tudo o que é preciso é que eles sejam chamados para estar nesse encontro e para alimentar esse encontro. E é isso que nossa iniciativa vem buscando, ao dialogar com o governo, com a ONU, com movimentos sociais, com organizações da sociedade civil e com a academia. Bora fazer da COP30 um momento de mudança para que a comida que chega no nosso prato, além de saudável e deliciosa, seja também solução climática e não mais um problema? Um abraço.
Thank you so much to Mauricio. I hope you're watching for this excellent provocation. I think there were some really important insights that he discussed around the relationship between climate action and food systems and land use transition, and the importance of having smallholder farmers at the table to be a part of policy conversations. I'll say that in my own work, this is a really important emerging area in the broader field of nature and climate finance, as there are a growing number of policymakers and financial institutions and multinational corporations that are interested in working with smallholders to transition to more agroecological approaches. But we know that this is costly and challenging, and we need to create financial instruments and policy incentives to accelerate this transition that aren't always there. Knowing that, for example, to transition from industrial monoculture to regenerative agricultural practices takes between 3 to 5 years. And it involves some significant upfront costs and some dips in productivity as the transition is occurring before, coming back to level and hopefully beyond in terms of profit making again. And so we definitely need more tools in our toolkit to support farmers trying to make these changes, and supply chains that likewise are interested in moving in the right direction. And of course, ensure that all stakeholders involved are at the table to make sure that the strategies that are developed are ones that are going to work for them and their livelihoods and their communities, and as well as nature and climate. I'm sure that our panelists also may have some thoughts on this topic. So let me turn to you again with the next round of questions. Alejandro, I'm curious, what specific policies or institutional reforms do you think are necessary to create an enabling environment for the bioeconomy in Colombia? And this could include food systems transition. I'm sure there may be other examples to speak to as well. And what are some of the challenges that you're seeing right now?
Gracias, Julie, por la.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for the introduction and the question. Well, we have seen this as a government. So the first point is environmental services, and these are ecosystems. So it's the payment for environmental services, and this is for the communities to conserve and see the territories. This is the model. And then you can make this debate. And we know that this second point is the nucleus of development. And this is called the conservation areas in the country. And they are nuclei where you have this sort of reforestation. And this is what we're looking at here. These are areas that are important. And then this is sustainable and etc. And the third point actually is we see the macroeconomic instruments. We're talking about bank transactions. So we have more than 33 banks, and this is an economic project for the banking sector. And it was possible to do this. It was possible to enable this through mechanical and financial systems. And this has allowed the companies to do this. And then we have SIMA. So this is the system that they have, which was to use the resources that were available for the anchor companies and the entities were able to strengthen all of this. And these transactions are commissioned by Julie. And this was biodiversity and the climatic part, and this will be sustainable. So as a result, we can strengthen these different methodologies to look at bioeconomy in the country.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. And I think that another point here that sometimes gets lost, but I know is of increasing interest and a real challenge, is around finance for adaptation and resilience, and its links to the bioeconomy and the role of the bioeconomy as a really important source of not just physical shock absorption and resilience, but also fiscal resilience. So we recently did a piece of work where we looked at Nature Finance, the cocoa industry in Ghana and the reduced productivity there because of climate-related challenges, and how significant investments in agroforestry-based approaches in the near term would not only help improve the longevity and productivity of cocoa production in that country over time, it would also create up to $1 billion of new revenues in carbon credits. It would also potentially help positively impact the country's credit rating going forward, so help deal with some of the sovereign debt challenges that many countries are also facing at the same time. So one can imagine a world going forward where countries are issuing a bond with a key performance indicator around bioeconomy and transition to more nature positive approaches for key economic sectors that have as much to do with economic and financial resilience as they do with biodiversity and climate impacts as well. With that, Brenda, I would love to turn to you now, and recognizing that you sit on Conavio and advise through IDB Invest, you're so well positioned to see both the policy and investment sides of things, which don't always align as we would hope that they would. So I'm curious to hear from you, what are some of the key gaps that you see in policy or financing that you think we need to address if we're truly going to scale the bioeconomy in Latin America, and anything in the domain of food systems, specifically in light of the video we saw that strikes you as well? Thanks.
Obrigada pela pergunta, Julie.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Julie. So bringing in a little bit of what we have seen, definitely there are other views and many of the initiatives map this context as a whole. So the scenario that we have been working on, and this transition is just like what its name says, it's very dynamic. And at the same time that we identify the challenges, it is necessary to think quickly about the solutions, and we don't always have the input that is necessary to develop these solutions, to be able to reach a transition that is equitative and fair and ecological and sustainable, which is beneficial to all of the agents in the production chains, for example. And regarding the political aspect, we have a few challenges in different spheres. So considering that the Brazilian policy, Brazilian politics, the way that it's formulated, we still have challenges where the policies are fragmented in different sectors, as well as the responsibility itself. That's also divided into a legislation that is only municipal or only from the state or at a federal level. So this legislation, first of all, for any environmental topic, even the licensing, environmental licensing, this needs to be efficient and this needs to be complementary. So they need to be in the same line. speaking the same language. And many times we don't see this in practice. We don't see this happening. And also for those laws that are the protection of a certain territory that is inside the state protection, and sometimes the responsibility is thrown from one to the other. We also have this fragmentation of policies where sometimes you have an effort, a repetitive effort amongst the sectors of the government. So sometimes the solution or a policy is working inside the municipal secretary of sustainability. And then in the same city, there's another initiative where you have a project and something that can become a municipal policy in the same city hall, but in another secretariat with other agents, with other employees and other resources, when in fact the governance could be done in a more participative and integrative manner between the secretariats of the same city hall. So something that I have seen a lot in practice. And when we think about climate policy or protection to biodiversity, we need a maximum number of players to have the responsibility and to be working together in these initiatives. And it's an effort that I see that the IBD, the public IBD, I don't know if I talked about this, but I worked in the city hall of my city about 2 or 3 years ago in a sustainability secretariat, and we had projects that were funded by the IBD. And all of the methodology, the way of working, it was exactly to try and bring these sectors together. So I really defend participative governance as a solution in the fragmentation between the sectors. So all of them need to work together. And then formulating these public policies in the medium and long term. And if they become part of the territories in the cities, this policy should not be, how can I say this? It must continue to exist regardless of the government that is taking on the new mandate, the state policies. So it must work independently from whoever is going to take on the government in this next mandate after a few years. It is also necessary, and I say this in general, for all of the countries in Latin America. And I think Brazil is one of the countries that are leading the national strategies about bioeconomy. So to formulate these instruments of public policies, many times we're going to listen to the different actors and they're going to have a participative methodology, listening to the third sector, listening to the communities, listening to the companies, listening to the other secretariats from the government, to be able to formulate this instrument, this robust instrument that can also be a model and can be replicated in other countries that don't have it yet. So I have seen the effort that the Brazilian government has made, and also Itamaraty, the Brazilian government in terms of the National Commission of Biodiversity, together with other areas of the federal government. They have tried to bring together these efforts, but I think that there's still a lot to be done. And for us to really have more success trying to get to this transition, the full transition. Now, looking at the private sector, I can see that, and also talking about the multilateral institutions, I have seen a very positive experience where I see that the multilateral organs, the banks and the companies, the startups that are actually placing new solutions in the market, they have had great interest in categorizing what the activities that are going to incorporate human nature and finance. So dividing the activities within the production model, and this is categorized as nature finance. So they're not going to be damaging to nature or to society, and they're going to not only be damaging, but they're also going to have a way of increasing the biodiversity, impacting socio-bioeconomy through the production activities. So, in other words, it's not only working to avoid environmental damage, but also bringing the nature positive as an instrument to add more value and to protect, maintain, and conserve nature and also culture. So I see that there are many challenges, but they're also debating lots of solutions. And these solutions are multifaceted. So they need many players working together and a lot of different spaces for discussion. So the way of operationalizing it is for these solutions.
So I'd love to pick up on something that you sort of implied in your remarks, Brenda, as a question really to both you and Alejandro, which is that throughout the globe, and definitely including where I'm based in the United States, we have seen a lot of big electoral swings back and forth from different sides of the spectrum in terms of levels of ownership and commitment politically to this agenda around biodiversity and climate action and its links to sustainable development. And so, you know, it's really challenging when there's so much whiplash in the system back and forth, and it means that policy resilience is really a challenge kind of at all levels. And it's critical that we're not all counting on one leader in any context to be the driver of this agenda, but ensuring that there's a lot of ownership and a lot of leadership and support from all different parts of a country, community, society, to keep things moving forward. So in that vein, you talked a little bit about action at the municipal level, at the state level. I know in our own work, we've seen different cities, for example, in Brazil, expressing interest in pursuing pilots on biodiversity credits, and states exploring nature's infrastructure approaches, often in partnership with a national development bank or a multilateral development bank. So I'm just curious, both kind of what you're seeing, each of you in your own domains, in terms of more distributed leadership on this agenda throughout different parts of government and society. And then also, to the extent that you feel comfortable kind of speculating or commenting, what parts of this agenda feel like they really resonate with communities at the local level? I mean, often in our world, we're sort of talking to people who already are deeply invested in the science and understand all of the risks and challenges almost from an academic point of view. And we know that for really busy people caught up in the day-to-day of often really hectic lives and experiences, that they're not necessarily going to prioritize the bioeconomy in their own daily lives unless they see how it connects to things that are more proximate and important to them. So I'm curious both about kind of where you're seeing that leadership taking place, and knowing that mayors, you know, need to know that this is going to be a winning issue for them if they're going to get behind it, kind of how they think about relating it to the people in their own communities. Whoever wants to go first, just jump in.
Bueno, Brenda, dale, gracias. Entonces,
Thank you,
mira, te cuento.
Brenda. So,
Y las personas que están conectadas. En Colombia, pues como
so
ministerio,
in Colombia,
excelente rector de la
in the
política ambiental,
ministry,
estamos trabajando en
we
una
talk
serie de
about
iniciativas
environmental
que les
policies, and we think about a series of tools that work for environmental authorities and for the communities. So they can get these inputs and they can say, okay, so what in Colombia and Bogota, the capital, what do they say about economy? Because we understand this in the big cities, right? But this does not get to the territory. And it's important to mention that bioeconomy, it's been more than 10 years. Remember that bioeconomy is a synonym of sustainable use of a bioeconomy. So, and don't think that bioeconomy is different. So they were developing these associations in terms of production and the added value and social projects. So that was one thing. But the second point is that politically, we started working on sustainable bioeconomy. It's a document that has the planning of the work, so how to organize all the different places, all the city halls to say, okay, this is bioeconomy, and how are we going to contribute 3% of the GDP? If you're a company, how are you going to be part of this bioeconomy? Is this going to be part of tourism and renewable energies? What is the contribution here? Because the objective of bioeconomy is a way to get to this energy transition, to selling the production, right? And come out of the extractive area, which is the use of natural resources. So we have a few options. The third one is that Colombia is part of multiple areas. And we are contributing with the Amazon products. We are inside the bioeconomy institution in Latin America and in Costa Rica last year. We were there and we're part of the bioeconomy in all these countries. And these people and entities, they say it's more of the same thing, but it's more of a scenario where you have lots of players and each one contributes to take this message. And the best out of all this is that there are dialogues and they put the projects on the table and they articulate these processes. And finally, bioeconomy is a process that since 2018 in Colombia, it got into the political document that talks about a circular economy. So circular economy and forest economy. So these are different spheres that we have here where the country has organized its house. So in Colombia, when we talk about circular economy, we're talking about alternatives for plastic and fiscal incentives, the use of plastic, and in the forest, we are valuing compensation in a different way. In the resources coming from the coast, because Colombia also looks at the sea, right? 50% of our territory faces the sea. So we also have to think about the communities that have raised their hands and said, okay, how are we going to do a bioeconomy here in the coast of the country? And the topic of the microplastics, we have lots of initiatives. And Brenda is a leader as well, here in Colombia as well. And we strengthen these processes from the NGOs. And in a way, in the forest, we have two strategic plans. So this is an invitation that I make to BioExpo in October. And this is a window of green business that is going to be done in Leticia, a city in Colombia. And they're going to evaluate and discuss and place all of these cards on the table, everything about bioeconomy. So the first one is bioeconomy of the Colombian Pacific shores, where we have highly diverse products, and we also have the Amazon. So we have two political fronts, and in Colombia, we have 7 indigenous organizations that are involved in the process, and they are also being connected to this project. And then there's the private financial part, because in this global agenda in 2020. This leads us to great aspects like the mobilization of resources. So it's not only asking for money, but also being part of the system for the planet. So they talk about the independence and how the companies are going to be associated to biodiversity and how they understand this. So in other words, how I recycle, if I have neutral carbon, if I sell carbon, if I understand this diversity, because diversity also has to do with understanding sustainable consumption and this change in mindset, just like the rivers and the trees and the birds and nature. But we have to understand that there are motors for this loss in diversity. And we have to characterize this so that everybody will know about it. Everybody will know about contamination and the increase of 1.5 degrees in the world, the temperature, and this affects biodiversity. So we have to understand this kind of dynamics, and in responding, there is a spectrum of opportunities, but we're working on a toolbox so that people who make the decisions, they can understand what bioeconomy is. Because we also want to think about the ways of doing it, transport, getting to the places, reducing poverty. We have to think about employment, but it is something that can solve the dynamics or contribute to this institution and generate opportunities as well.
Thank you, Alejandro. And I have to say, it's really heartening to hear so much leadership coming from the Colombian government in this domain. I think that it sends really important signals, even to be having these kinds of conversations and outreach to companies about what they should be thinking about. I mean, you can't take for granted where those conversations are absent. It's very easy, for the private sector to not necessarily prioritize certain risks or challenges or externalities over others. So the fact that you are elevating these issues so centrally and also framing them as an opportunity landscape for so much innovation and dynamism, rather than just a bunch of risks that need to be mitigated, I think is also hugely important. Brenda, do you want to come in with your thoughts on the question?
Sim, eu gostei muito da
Yes, I
explanação
really liked the explanation that Alejandro brought us. And now talking a little bit about the issue that Julie mentioned, which is many times we are too busy and we're speaking a language that many times is not accessible to the small producers, for the people who are doing bioeconomy inside the forests or working with regenerative agricultural crops, or with tourism with a community base, or other solutions based on nature. So I also agree that where there are gaps, these are spaces for develop solutions. So they are opportunities for us to develop solutions. How can you generate these solutions, right? We need investment, and I think it's also a great opportunity for the private sector to invest in research and development and innovation. So how can you leave a production chain? How can you make it more sustainable so that it will be able to provide these inputs and guarantee that the inputs will be recurrent and there is a periodic production and reducing the risk of the business. So I see a lot of concern of the IBD Invest, and they are trying to observe opportunities to create specific credit lines. So the world is looking for a transition towards a more sustainable productivity, a more ecological productivity, but we also need the private sector and at the same time the public sector to act within their little boxes. Let's say it like that. We need the regulation, we need the legislation, and for the private sector, we need to have the specific credit lines that can encourage a bioeconomy that generates a high risk of the business, that takes into consideration the risks of the business, of the production, but will also bring these solutions to minimize this risk. And they will understand that it is very different. It's an economy based on nature, which is different from a production system that is extractive, that brings degradation of the environment. And the logic of construction is completely different from a system that is completely capitalistic. So it is important to look at this bias coming from these gaps and to understand how these solutions can be developed and who can develop these solutions and work as a network or work with a network of players. That's why it's important. And sometimes a solution is going to be thought out in the Amazon and for the savanna, right? If you think about separation according to the biomes, maybe it's not going to work. Maybe we need another kind of solution that will bring an increase in biodiversity in that specific location. But we already have some mechanisms as part of the strategies of the private sector. So inversion, just like blended finance, also the green bonds. So opportunities where the producer is able to access, he can access them to develop the business. And many times we're already talking about communities, local communities and traditional people. They're really living their lives in their way of production. And it's very different from others who are more focused on the financial benefit that that business is going to bring. So sociobioeconomy is going to also go through spheres like the training or bringing in help for this population, and maybe even some legal help. Maybe there's some organization like fishing associations or agricultural associations, farmer associations. They will access these tools to be able to help in this organization, this financial organization, and that of the whole production chain that they develop there, even to increase the scale. So definitely there are many challenges, but with socio-bioeconomy that has a different logic compared to the capitalist and the extractive one, I think it is a solution. It's a solution that can be implemented in the long term.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And there's two things that struck me about what you said. I mean, one around scaling the bioeconomy and thinking about the kinds of regulation and financing needed. One area that has gotten less attention, but I think increasingly becomes more important, probably for obvious reasons, is around trade and the ways in which trade can be either an enabler or a real hindrance to the scaling of bioeconomy. So we're at a really interesting kind of wild moment internationally around trade, where you have the US tariffs and unpredictability and uncertainty there, and a kind of broader anti-ESG kind of movement afoot. And then you have in Europe, for example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the deforestation regulations and different kinds of incentives focused on trying to embed an orientation around sustainability, whether in the right or wrong ways. I'm sure many have thoughts, but to try and navigate that landscape and recognize at the same time that there are barriers even regionally in terms of moving products and different kinds of fertilizers or waste material across borders. And in scaling enterprises, there are still subsidies that actually make using fossil fuel-based plastic higher value than using bio-based plastic alternatives right now. And so it is an area where, likewise, when one thinks about opportunities, there are some parts of the region that may make more sense to have a value-added sort of textile manufacturing facility for different bio-based materials coming from other countries, or one country might make most sense to have a biofuel refinery for the region to add value to biofuels coming from multiple places, but it takes kind of, I guess, having a collective strategy and vision of where people see this sector going and how they want to scale it both domestically and regionally, to be able to process those dimensions. And the other piece I just briefly wanted to mention, because it really resonates from conversations I was having with stakeholders in South Africa at the Finance in Common Summit a few months ago, is around the kind of the need for developing new habits of thinking around solutions for different challenges in industries. And so there was a water bond that was issued in the city of Cape Town for this extraordinary crisis that they were having. And they did a bunch of studies, and they looked at desalination, and they looked at drilling the aquifers. And it turned out that at the end of the day, getting rid of invasive species was just as effective as desalination, for example, of water. And it was 12 times cheaper and created more jobs within the community and had all of these other co-benefits for biodiversity and climate. And in talking about that, one example of kind of thinking about nature as infrastructure with a number of multilateral development banks, they noted that right now, when they think about project origination, project development, everyone's in the habit of immediately just thinking of gray infrastructure and not necessarily stepping back and doing the cost benefit analysis of different green opportunities and alternatives. But there was equally a lot of enthusiasm for developing the skills and the muscle to be able to do that going forward. So just to reinforce the point that you made, that it is important to kind of actively build new habits of taking nature into account in creative ways. I know we're heading towards the end of our time together here, so I'm going to ask one last question of each of you. I'm going to start, Alejandro, with you, and I want to kind of turn to Colombia's role, increasingly significant role as a leader on biodiversity agenda and climate agenda, including hosting COP16 in Cali last, which was a really incredible event. I'm curious how you think that increased regional collaboration in the region can enhance action around this bioeconomy and climate nexus that we've been discussing, and any particular steps that Colombia is thinking about in terms of its own leadership in this area, and including if there's anything in the upcoming COP30 opportunity where you think there's important opening to continue these kinds of conversations.
Gracias,
Muito
Julie,
obrigado, Julie. Obrigado pela informação. So we have leadership in COP16, and there were other countries that supported this. And inside biodiversity, it's important. What was seen at this point is that we had a moment of negotiations, and the mainstream, or the part about safety, we saw that there were several actions done, and we focused on 6 production areas. We have tourism, agriculture, mining, and fishing, and several processes inside these sectors. So what these sectors understand of working with biodiversity, and then giving a concrete response to this, we have something called mainstreaming with the countries it was approved with, and we are trying to work to increase the biodiversity knowledge in these production areas. So COP is coming, and we have to articulate the ATCs with the MSOPs, and this is inside the global commitments, right? So it is an exchange. Maybe It depends on the carbon emissions, and carbon also works in the Amazon with everything that is being placed. That means collaboration. And then we can see the processes that we can work together on, and all of this with the mobilization of these players and how we can generate value so that this is not dispersed, so that we can focus and not lose this. So with the IBD, we were able to have a lot of investment, and they are an ally to our ministry, and they're very welcome to add to our efforts. And also with other countries that have a lot of biodiversity in the Pacific or the Atlantic, we can still work together. So, Julie, I would say that we have to think about these comments to be able to get to the end of my presentation and say that we have to form these alliances with the international areas, and this is part of the processes that we need. And it's 3% of the GDP that I had already talked about. This is the biodiversity plan of the country. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot to implement, and you're all very welcome to collaborate with us during these next few years.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. And Brenda, my last question for you is related to your role as a youth leader in the biodiversity space for over a decade and helping to build national and international youth networks. And this feels like a very hopeful and positive note to sort of conclude on in terms of what you think young people can do to help shape the future of the bioeconomy in some of the places where you spent a lot of time engaging with youth communities, and how can institutions like governments and development banks and even private sector actors help better support that leadership?
Obrigada pela pergunta.
Thank you for the
Eu
question.
vou começar pelo final
I'm going to
da
start by the
primeiro,
end of the
né?
question, first of all. So
Os organismos
the
multilaterais,
multilateral organs, the banks, the governments, they need to create effective spaces so that the youth will be able to participate politically in an effective manner, in listening as well as in the participative and construction processes of the policies and these areas of discussion. So we had the COP about biodiversity in Colombia, and youth had participation. We were able to build together with the government our global diversity network. There was also space to work with them, and also during the conference itself. But at smaller levels, it is also necessary at that specific moment of the conferences and an international conference. It's not only at these moments, it is also necessary that the youth in the different countries can be heard and taken into account for this participative governance in the construction. And we're going to have COP30 in Brazil, and recently it was elected as the champion. Marceli is a young girl from the periphery of Rio de Janeiro, and she has a strong discourse about the connection between climate, nature, and culture. Because in fact, already answering the first part of the question, youth is active. And I think for more than a decade, I was able to develop an idea or a perception about how, in a little over 10 years, youth has become interested, increasingly interested in the problems and the conflicts and the socioeconomic issues that nature brings, and they have accessed quality information, and they are also interested in building and demanding these areas of participation in decision making. But it is necessary for this space to be efficient, to be effective, and this should reflect upon the interests of this generation, because very soon they are, or they will contribute, or they're already contributing strongly to the economy of the country. And we can see that this generation, this young generation, my generation, the younger generation, has also done a lot of training. The internet and access to the internet, access to digital technology has made this easier. Access to information and the different shapes of the organization. So nowadays, for example, we have the opportunity of being able to exchange knowledge, exchange an organization, or do some sort of activity, or have some initiative with youth. I always talk about youth as a plural word to try and reflect upon the social diversity that we have, of having indigenous young people, also young people from the periphery and from the rural areas. Each one will have a different reality and different needs, as well as different perspectives that can contribute in this socioeconomic scenario. So youth wants to be in COP30, COP30. They want to be there not only to learn and to identify opportunities, because they don't want to work within this system anymore, the system of production, or using the same exploratory model for the natural resources. We need green jobs. We need to allocate this youth in employment that is going to bring more sustainability and protection to the environment. And they have also developed their startups and their ways and projects, their innovation. But it is also necessary to have financial support that can come from the private sector, and offering scholarships and training, and even offering different competitions for, using creativity. So young people are very creative, and also respecting the different realities and needs. Also with regard to languages. So Brazilians, they don't have access from their childhood, especially in the public schools, maybe because of culture, and I'm sure because of lack of access to foreign language. So when we get to exchanging international experience, young people, they are limited in-person conversations, and this doesn't allow them to participate effectively, because participating is not only being there in person with your body. No, it's especially to be able to express yourself and to be able to bring a little bit of the reality in the place they live in. And so to close my presentation, out of everything that we talked about here, to create areas for dialogue and collaboration between subnational and national governments amongst the countries themselves. I believe that the current government of Brazil is exchanging a few cards with the previous government that made other climate conferences and biodiversity as well, and also include the social inclusion effectively. So the indigenous and traditional communities, and really create this working network with financial institutions, with national and international organizations, to align all these policies about climate and nature. So I think there are many people thinking about solutions. We just need to add all of these efforts, bring them together, and follow a path together. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And I know we only have 1 minute left, so I'm going to be really quick and trying to just give 3 headlines and then thank the panelists here. First, I think that from Alejandro and Brenda today, we heard just tremendous examples of leadership across the region at the municipal, state, national level, amongst youth, different civil society networks, multilateral development banks like the IDB, some corporate actors, and I don't take that for granted in the current landscape, that it's really important to have that momentum. And I think we heard a lot about it today in terms of engagement at the nexus of biodiversity and climate in terms of the bioeconomy's development. That said, I think we also heard that there's a lot of room for intensifying collaboration, for continuing to integrate biodiversity and climate and kind of center the opportunities of the bioeconomy from global fora to more coherence at the municipal level in terms of different projects, to enabling regulation and strengthening inclusion in processes, whether it's and ownership as well of this agenda, whether it's with youth constituencies or mayors and local political constituents sort of across the spectrum. And then finally, I think we've heard a lot about how the bioeconomy represents this really important alternative vision for an economic paradigm that doesn't rely on unsustainable fossil fuel production, that really centers equity and democratic participation in important ways, and can be a huge source of innovation and enterprise development and jobs going forward. And so I hope that we will continue to build on this momentum at COP30 and beyond. And I'm so grateful to our incredible panelists for participating in this discussion today and sharing all of your insights. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Julie and Brenda. Thank you very much. See you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.